Welcome to the show. I'm Patrick, CEO of Sano Genetics, and I'm very excited to be here with Dr. Giles Yeo. Giles is a researcher at the University of Cambridge, studying the genetics underlying obesity and appetite control. And he's also the author of a best-selling book called Gene Eating, which I thought was a very refreshing and new take on the science of obesity and dieting, and some people have called it the anti-fad diet book. So one review that I read of it, which was quite nice, I thought, was, in the age of misinformation and pseudoscience, the world is getting fatter and the diet makers are getting richer. So how do we break the cycle that's killing us all? I think that's a great lead-in. So Giles, welcome to the show, and thanks so much for being here.
No, thank you for having me. Thanks for having me, Patrick.
Yeah,
fantastic.
Great. So to start off, I know earlier in your career you worked on rare genetic disorders that cause people to actually literally be unable to control their appetite. So I think an example of that would be Prader-Willi syndrome.
That's right.
But now you work on both rare and common genetics underlying obesity. So before we get into the science, I was hoping maybe you could just tell us how you got into studying obesity in the first place.
Oh, I got into studying obesity entirely serendipitously by luck. So I did do my PhD on the genetics of pufferfish. Now listen, that is just not going to pay anyone's mortgage. So when I was finished, I was a trained geneticist. I was looking around for a job. Some of the early genetic work on severe obesity had just been done within my department, and so I knocked on the door. I said, "Hi, I'm a geneticist," and they needed a geneticist, and that was 1998, and that's how I got started. Entirely by, I needed a job, and the lab was there. Right person, right time, right place.
So could you explain to us how rare conditions like Prader-Willi syndrome, for example, work? What is it in the body that causes this uncontrollable appetite?
Now, Prader-Willi syndrome is more complex,
right?
So it's probably not a great example to necessarily kick off with, but Prader-Willi syndrome is thought to lead to disruptions within the hypothalamus. Okay, but I think a better example probably is something to do with mutations within what we call the leptin-melanocortin pathway, which also occurs in the hypothalamus. And that pathway is in effect a fat-sensing pathway. And it's critical because your brain needs to know two pieces of information in order to control food intake. It needs to know how much fat you have, because how much fat you have is how long you would last in a while.
Right, if you're starving or whatever.
Exactly, without any food. And it also needs to know what you've just eaten, which is signals from the gut, the short-term signals. But if you actually don't have signals from your fat, for example, and your brain doesn't know how much fat you have, then it doesn't know when you're starving, or if you lack the signal, it thinks you're starving all the time.
Right, so it's like a feedback.
Yeah. And so what happens is there are these very rare conditions which in effect have the brain think that you're starving all the time, which means that, look, when you're slightly hungry, when you're very hungry, the simplest foods taste like the greatest things in the world, the rice and the bread. And then the fuller you get, the more picky you become.
Right.
But if you're actually starving, like plane crash in the Andes, type of stuff, I want to eat someone else starving, well then you're going to eat all kinds of stuff in order to keep yourself alive, including frozen food. And so these kids do that, and they end up being severely obese. Right. And we kind of use genetics, both in humans and in animal models, to kind of work out this pathway. And so that was the early part of my career, was spent working this out together with my colleagues, not just me.
Right. So mutations or inherited genetic variation that acts primarily in the brain that affects the way we actually understand and sense our own body.
That's right. That's
so
right.
The rare mutations that happen in these genetic conditions, is it the same pathway that happens in the population more generally, but just different genetic variants or different degrees of effect, or is it something different entirely?
No. As it turns out, this particular pathway, this leptin-melanocortin, because earlier on when I was working on this, one of the criticisms that was thrown at me was why are you working on these rare conditions? And they're rare.
They're rare. Yeah.
Your butterfly collecting, it has no relevance to regular normal human, normal in inverted commas, disease.
Yeah.
As it turns out, with the onset of genome-wide association studies and whole genome analysis, so from a hypothesis-free scenario, this same pathway has emerged. Right. So in other words, while severe mutations within the leptin-melanocortin pathway lead to severe Mendelian obesity, so you single gene defects, very subtle changes in the pathway influences where we sit on the normal distribution of body weight. So yes, the same, I mean, it's not only this pathway, because clearly there are several hundred genes that are now involved, but this pathway emerges as one of the powerful influences of body weight amongst, so it's not just obesity, we're talking about normal distribution of body weight, whether or not you're skinny, average, or fat, or severely obese.
Yeah, so I've heard you talk, and I think you probably mentioned this in your book as well, that also different people have different, let's call it vices or sweet tooth. So I really like sugary foods, for example, but I think you've said before that you like fatty foods. You like fatty foods.
In fact, and that is going to have a genetic influence. I mean, another example, I mean, we're here in this fantastic place here, is I call the meeting room scenario.
Right.
And so if it's there. Exactly. If it's there and suddenly you're in a meeting and someone puts a plate of cookies on the table, I think there are 4 types of people that are there. Right. You might disagree with me. There are going to be people who reach for the cookie immediately, okay, and just start eating it. There are going to be people who desperately want to eat the cookie, stare at it the entire time, not eat the cookie, but then ignore the meeting. Yeah. There are others who just don't even know the cookies are there, and there are others who eat the cookie without even knowing the cookie is there.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And so these are the people who don't think before they eat. And I think that is probably a good representation of human beings' reaction to food, and a lot of that's going to be down to our genetic influences.
Yeah. And so you mentioned before there are hundreds of genes.
Yeah.
Probably many more to be discovered.
Yeah.
Right. Is it yet possible to look at a single individual, find which combination of genes they have genetic variance in, and start to predict some of these behaviors, whether it's appetite control or what their BMI is, or maybe even further whether they like sweet foods, fatty foods, or how much do we know and how much is still yet to be discovered?
So I think these genes, in this post-genomic world that we're actually living in, undoubtedly are, particularly for something like BMI, okay, which is objective and it is what it is. It's not subject to any imagination whatsoever or memory. It's there. It's very good to determine a risk of where you sit, or the likelihood of where you might sit within a specific BMI on a population level. Personal prediction is still poor.
Much harder, right?
It's still much harder, and largely because of our largely because of two reasons. First, we're only still measuring a small percentage of the genetic variation within us. That's the first thing. And second, our terrible ability to measure the environment. Okay?
Right.
Those two things. Which means that the moment you leave something like BMI or waist to hip ratio, which is another easily measurable and it's a very objective measure, when you begin to go to the coffee table, the meeting room scenario, how do you measure that? And I think the measurement of the environmental phenotype, your behavior to the food, that is very, very difficult.
Right.
And until we are able to measure the environment with precision in a large scale, because I think we can measure environments.
Hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah. How do you do that? We're not going to be able to nail down the genes. There are going to be genes about why some people, the cookie scenario, there are going to be genes which influence our scenario.
Right.
We just can't measure that behavior clean enough in a large enough number of people to find those genes yet.
Right. So to tie it to a specific example, I have a good friend who can eat thousands of calories a day, but he stays skinny. He's got a 6-pack, and there's clearly something going on there where if he and I take in the same amount of calories, his body's processing it differently, but that's incredibly tricky to measure and understand. Is that right?
It is. So what's interesting is all of the genome-wide association studies, all of the genetic studies to date, looking at BMI and food intake, have found genes which are only associated with food intake, interestingly. Okay, so this is
right.
But does that mean that nothing is explaining the expenditure? No, because studies by Claude Bouchard, for example, using twins, in which identical twins were fed, pairs of identical twins were fed exactly the same thing. Now, within the twin pair, okay, they gain exactly the same amount of weight.
Right.
Okay, but intra-twin pairs, they gain differing amount of weight.
Exact same amount of food.
Exactly.
Right.
Same amount of food, exactly the same amount of activity, but they gain. So clearly, they're going to be genetic influences. The problem is imperfect though it is, it's far easier to measure something which you're eating because it's physical. It's there. You can weigh it. You can actually see it. Than it is to measure energy expenditure or physical activity. Physical activity is probably
getting
measurable,
easier, right? Yeah.
But metabolic rate is notoriously difficult to measure, at least on a large scale. And I think the moment we are able to do that in hundreds of thousands of people, once again with precision, we will find genes for it.
Right. So you need to, in a perfect scenario, you need to have people, you need to know exactly what they ate. Maybe you even want to measure how much they're, what are they getting rid of through,
I can't imagine it's beyond the wit of man. Google, for example, have been, I don't know if they're still, investing in it, but designed at some point a contact lens that was able to sense glucose, okay? And I don't know how good it is. But surely it's not beyond the wit of whoever, anyone else, to invent a little pill which sits in your stomach
and monitors.
Okay, it doesn't know if you've had how you've cooked your chicken, but it knows your macronutrient content and fiber content, and just sends it by Bluetooth to your phone. I can't imagine that is beyond the wit of man to design something like that. The moment we get that, in other words, we know then, okay, well, what is actually coming in? Then we know exactly that you've had 22.2% protein today, objectively. And the number of calories, I think then we're going to get far better, far more predictable genetic information.
So this is maybe a good segue into the question of diets, because if we recognize that probably everybody does respond to different kinds of foods, but maybe we don't know it yet, how does someone determine, for example, is a low carb diet, is a high fat diet the right one for me? Or maybe we should just take a step back and say, what I've heard you say before, that a lot of these fad diets have a kernel of truth in them, right? So there's something, obviously you don't want to have a huge amount of sugary drinks and carbs, but it doesn't necessarily mean we adopt a paleo diet where we hunt live game like our ancestors in air quotes,
like Flintstones,
right? Like Flintstones, yeah. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I think, just very quickly with the paleo diet, and then I'll go to more general. The paleo diet is fantasy because it assumes a singular diet, and there was no singular paleo diet because there was no singular paleo person.
Right, people all over the world.
That's right. I mean, you could have been Inuit, Eskimo, and eaten largely seal and whale blubber. That's probably true. Okay.
Have you ever had that before? Is it?
I have not had seal.
I
have had whale before.
Right.
And once again, I was in Norway. I wasn't hunting it, but I felt that I was there. It's just very rich steak, which I can't imagine that's what seal is like.
Yeah.
Or if you were living on the Serengeti, you may very well have been largely vegetarian.
Right. Absolutely.
Exactly. But anyway, no, there are a lot of. So at the end of the day, what is a diet, right? A diet is a strategy to. If you're trying to lose weight, a diet is a strategy to eat slightly less or move slightly more so that you lose the weight. And I think as long as you achieve that, and all the diets that do work do achieve that, then you'll lose weight, and then it works. It doesn't work when you come off the diet. And so actually, many of these fad diets actually do work, just never for the reasons that are stated on the
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes it takes trial and error, right? For some people, it's a particular diet that works for them for unknown
I think
reasons,
at the moment, let's put it this way. I do think that at some point in the future, that we will do it, and probably not that far away, that we will be able to have some kind of prediction based on genetics. I do think so. I'm a geneticist.
You would know.
I have to think so. But I think at the moment, the easiest way, the simplest way, the freest way to do it is actually to trial and error. But before you do that, to actually be honest with yourself, and I think you have to be if you want to lose weight, about what your weaknesses are. So in other words, in the coffee table scenario and the meeting table scenario, or whether or not you like sugary food or fat food, do you respond to stress by eating or not?
Right.
If you know what you do to food, you can write this down and say, okay, normally I respond to stress by eating. I like sweet food, blah, blah, blah. then at least you can begin to structure something which suits your own personal behavior. And I think that is the way to actually select a diet that at least you can sustain, because you have to sustain it to keep the weight off.
Right. So you start by just being honest and knowing yourself.
Yes.
And then work from there.
Yes.
So maybe you've already said the answer to this, but what role does genetic testing play in that today, and where do you think it's likely to go in the future? So does doing one of the at-home direct-to-consumer tests, are you likely to learn anything about what your diet should be, fitness regimes, or is it still a little early?
I think fitness regimes almost certainly no. Certainly the ones I've tried. So I'm not going to name any.
Yeah, please don't.
So I tried a genetic test. I was paid by a newspaper. I wasn't paid by the newspaper. The newspaper paid for me to take the test. To review it. And the problem, let me tell you what the problem was. The problem was they tested a total of just under 70 SNPs. That's it, 70 SNPs. And from there, they purported to be able to predict my physical activity and my diet.
Right.
And it was just impossible just based on 70 genes. I just think it is, because they just don't have enough information. That being said, okay, what I found out from the test was that I was lactose intolerant. Now you might look at me, I'm Chinese and no hair, but that's neither here nor there. So for those of you who, and you might think, well, surely you knew you were lactose intolerant. Well, I didn't.
Right.
And I think, and I did my personal crossover control. I removed my cappuccinos, shall we say, and shift the black Americanos, and I felt better. So I think, and I reintroduced it, and it didn't. So blah. But what is interesting is I think that people, a lot of this at the moment, direct-to-consumer tests mix up monogenic, so as a result predictable, so lactose, ability to digest alcohol, ability to metabolize caffeine.
Right.
Okay? Those are famously single genes, and so therefore, and coding, or at least demonstrably...
So changing a protein,
and so are predictable.
Right.
And they mix that in, okay, to people go, ooh, I am lactose intolerant, and therefore everything else must be true. But then they mix in complex traits, and they try.
You should do CrossFit, and it's like, okay, maybe not. Yeah.
But they've measured it using 3 genes. How do you tell you need CrossFit with 3 genes, or the fact that you digest fat better with 2 genes? It's just, that's the problem. They're mixing the polygenic complex traits with monogenic single gene traits.
Right, that makes sense. So going forward, you think, how do you see these tests evolving? We're going to get better at interpreting these more complex behaviors, hopefully.
I think so. And I just see these tests moving away from testing SNPs, because, I mean, what do we know? We know that, say with BMI, for example, we know that even with the 200 or so SNPs that we have, what is it explaining? 5, maybe 10%? I don't think so. 5% of the variation in BMI. So where is this missing heritability in inverted commas? And I think there are papers beginning to emerge out there, which people would have thought about previously, is that there are going to be private mutations, so rare mutations.
Just in you or your family.
Exactly, which are probably explaining a large chunk of the variation. And that is only going to emerge through whole exome, or probably whole genome sequencing.
Right.
And so I think where we'll actually make real progress are 2 things. Look, whole genome sequencing is actually getting down to an almost affordable to the person on the street, a rich person on the street, cost. What? 1,000 in large enough? What? 1,000?
500, 600.
Exactly. Okay, $1,000 or 500, 600, 700 pounds.
Right.
So it's not available to everybody, but it's not impossible. Couple that with a better ability to measure the environment, then I think we're beginning to get to a situation where we can begin to say, big data, and we can begin to really put together some good predictions of our behaviors.
Right, interesting. So do you think that the healthcare system is going to get involved in this anytime soon, predictive genetic testing?
Oh my goodness. I mean, anytime soon. You see what is being mentioned by, not the Surgeon General, whoever the equivalent of the Surgeon General here is.
The Chief
Medical Officer. So already saying that, they want to use, sequencing, in order to tell people their risk of certain diseases.
Right.
Overstating it at the moment because of all the reasons I told you about. But do I think that at some point in the very near future we go to the GP we're born and our genome's sequenced? Probably. Actually, probably. Because if it gets to the stage where, we can actually leaving aside ethics and philosophy,
right.
just
a whole other conversation.
A whole other conversation. I think from a management of a population health scenario, once you get to the position where, say, you're able to predict, we're never going to be able to predict everything, but say you can predict a significant percentage of diseases or complex traits through sequencing the genome, do you really not think that we're going to end up doing it? I think we're going to end up doing it pretty soon, sooner rather than later. How do we avoid allowing insurance companies or other companies, any other type of thing,
bad actor,
which actually comes in to take advantage of that information to our detriment? That is something that we as a society need to discuss, and I need to think about.
Right. Do you have any thoughts on that? We don't have to get into the ethics and data privacy discussion, but is it something, is everybody going to have a hard drive at home, or is it more of a matter of a system that allows you to share it flexibly, or what do you see?
I think we're actually already having the pre-discussion of this in very many ways, in how we use social media. So look, what are in fact, you might even argue that we're giving more information through our use of social media.
Quite possibly, yeah.
Quite possibly, because of the interpretation, because we're showing our actual behavior rather than just our genes.
Yeah.
Now, it's the merging of the two that's the issue. But I think as we're discussing the social media elements of it, about how these major online companies are dealing with our data, I think this is a good rehearsal for how we'll actually deal with the genetic data. It's not going to be a hard drive at home. So it's going to be in the cloud somewhere, okay?
Right.
But how do we then protect that information? The same way as how we are protecting our heart rate information from our wearables, or our behavior of where we actually eat dinner or what we bought at the supermarket, okay?
Right.
All of this information is there in the cloud as well. So I think this is a good dry rehearsal for how we actually deal with that data.
Right.
I mean, I think the real explosion is when people map your DNA to your behaviors, and that is where we begin to get predictivity, and we'll need to have sorted out hopefully one element of it, so that when the genetics appears there, we are then better suited to begin to handle how we handle personal information online with everything that is going to be there.
So how much of this do you cover in the book? I know you do quite a bit of the genetics background, and do you have some thoughts in the book on how genetics and environment can be measured together and what the future looks like? So
I think I went slightly into more detail about the future element of it than I do in the book.
Maybe that's a new book.
But maybe it's that's a good idea. Yeah, I'll put my agents in touch with you. But I do discuss the limitations of genetic tests, of the direct-to-consumer genetic tests as they are today. And I do describe about the fact that, look, what is measuring 70 SNPs going to actually mean? Almost next to nothing. Right. And we need to be able to do, so I do talk about sequencing whole genomes and measuring the environment better. And I think that's what we do need to think about doing. I do think we need to, whether or not you're a company, the NHS, or a scientist within the field, I think that is what we should all be thinking thinking about.
Yeah. So if I make you health secretary for a day, maybe not a day, let's give you a couple months. What if we're just on the obesity, call it obesity epidemic, whatever you'd like to call it. What are the things we could do today, and what are the things we could do maybe on a 5 or 10 year horizon?
From obesity point of view?
Yeah, no pressure, just to solve it for us.
So what is interesting is there is genetics aside, and I'll get to the genetics in a, because obviously our genetic influence, the genetic influences of something like obesity is not just genes, it's going to be interaction with the environment.
Right.
But part of the environment is not just what we eat and what we think, or the weather, and in terms of what we're thinking, but about privilege. And that privilege is one of the environments. And there is this really uncomfortable, very uncomfortable association with the fact that in the West, United States, UK, Western Europe, that the lower you are in the socioeconomic class, the more likely you are to be obese.
Right.
and which is unlike being out in the sticks in China or in India, for example, where you don't have enough food, so you're really skinny. Okay?
Right.
So there's a very uncomfortable interaction there. And it's probably going to be down to privilege. And privilege comes in 3 different flavors. Cash.
Yeah.
Okay. Time, which means that you may have enough cash, but if you have 3 shifts, how are you going to do that? And food literacy. So literacy. So not necessarily reading ABC,
right,
but understanding what an antioxidant is within a food, for example. What is something that's high in fiber? And I just think that if you fix privilege, you fix quite a bit of
a lot of these things all at once, right?
So I've got a colleague of mine who studies Claire Llewellyn is her name, and she's the head of Gemini, the Gemini study down in London, twin studies.
Yeah.
And what she's shown is that if you actually take identical twins and look at the heritability of body weight, it's 70%, like the number that we all learned. What is interesting is that she measures food security in the house, so the quality of the environment within the house. The worse the food security is in the house, the higher the genetic impact. Okay?
Oh, interesting.
Whereas the better, so the more privileged you are, like by definition, the both of us will be privileged. We're here having a chat on a podcast.
Right.
The lower the genetic impact. Right. So by fixing the environment, we can mitigate against some of the genetic risk.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing I would do. But how are we going to fix privilege? That's
interesting. Yeah, that's a tough one.
But the second thing is, and look, I am not a big nanny state guy. I'm not, and the reason is because legislation, which I would mean taxation or compelling companies to do things, tend to always disproportionately affect the poor, the underprivileged, which exacerbates the problem, and makes lawyers rich. Sorry to lawyers out there. Whereas, so if we can convince companies to actually make food healthier, we will
show them that it's in their best interest, I suppose.
We live longer to spend more money with them. Yeah. Exactly, and we spend more money. But there are going to be certain circumstances which I think we can we can fix now. So, for example, when we go to W.H. Smith or whatever place you go to buy a pencil, why do we have to walk through an aisle of candy? Right. If you want to buy candy, go to the candy aisle. You're choosing to buy candy. I got no issues with that. But if you're going to buy a pencil,
and they make you walk through the candy aisle,
or you're going to put gas, or you're going to Boots to buy your paracetamol, why do you have to be tempted by the candy? Choose to buy your candy. Choose to buy a pencil. You don't. I don't think that should be mixed.
Yeah,
so that thing should be mixed.
I hate the way they do that at the airport. If the people at London Heathrow are listening, don't make us walk through the alcohol and sweets
at
aisle.
5 a.m. in the morning.
5 a.m. in the morning.
I don't need a shot of single malt whiskey. Not at 5 a.m. Leave me alone.
Yeah. Well, okay. No, I think that's it's a big ask, isn't it? To fix it, but we've got to start somewhere, don't we?
Start somewhere. We've certainly got to start discussion somewhere.
Yeah, no, that's great. Some of these things are some of them are very counterintuitive, aren't they? The way, I think there's this, people, I know I did for a long time have this perspective that differences in body weight are due to differences in metabolism and there's, but actually a lot of it is more subtle than that. It's the way our brain interacts with the environment and there's just so much to learn as well. We clearly don't understand the whole picture, and we need more detailed information on an individual level, and we also just need more. Genomics is still in its infancy.
Genomics, and it's the interpretation of it. Now we get a whole genome sequence. We do the assembly. That's fine. This is all automated now. It goes through the system. Then you make your calls. And then suddenly you realize that, hang on a second, all of us carry so many different mutations or changes that we never knew before. And in fact, I look back with slight embarrassment on some of the earlier papers in which we had done we just screened one gene.
And you found the gene.
Oh, look at this. It tracks with obesity. Does it? I mean, it did within that family, but how do we know? What about the other 2.9999 billion base
places to look? Yeah.
I know. And so I think all of us need to be more sophisticated with how we think about genetics.
Right. Fascinating stuff. Well, I think we'll wrap up there. If you're interested in this and you found it interesting, then I would encourage you to follow Giles on Twitter
at Giles Yeo.
You're also on Instagram, aren't you? You
at Giles Yeo as well.
Lots of pictures of food. Is that right?
And that's what I do. I don't judge. I'm not a judge.
That's great. So if you like food and you like learning about genetics and obesity, and also check out the book It's called Gene Eating. Can they buy it?
They can buy it
on
on
Amazon.
Amazon anywhere, yeah.
Okay, great. And I think that's it for now. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
A pleasure.
Speak to you soon.